Good evening, everyone. I wanted to take a moment to welcome you all to our first PACE Speaker Series event of the 2021 academic year. The Carter G. Woodson Center for Interracial Education at Berea College is launching our PACE program this year, and PACE stands for Poverty, Anti-Racism, Coalition Building, and Education. And this year, we're going to bring speakers into campus to discuss how these issues not only affect our lives, but also how you can take that knowledge and apply it back in your community to help keep us all moving forward toward a more just world. So tonight, our first speaker is Dr. Karsonya Wise Whitehead, and she's joining us to talk about how we can confront poverty, anti-racist behavior and practices, and how coalition building can be a part of that solution. Dr. Whitehead is an associate professor of communication and African American studies in the Department of Communication at Loyola University in Maryland, and the host of the award-winning radio show Today with Dr. K. In 2020, Dr. Whitehead was selected by the Daily Record as one of Maryland's top 100 women and by the Baltimore Sun as the best radio host. In 2019, she received the Collegium Visionary Award from the College of Holy Cross, the Exceptional Merit in Media Award, or EMMA, from the National Women's Political Caucus. The Baltimore Sun named her as one of Baltimore's 25 Women to Watch in 2019, and Essence Magazine included her on the 2019 Woke 100 list of Black women advocating for change. We are so pleased to have her join us as not only our inaugural year speaker, but our inaugural speaker, so the first speaker of our PACE Speaker Series. And we look forward to hearing what she has to say this evening in her talk titled, Getting in Good Trouble Right Now, a 21st Century Conversation. After Dr. Whitehead's talk, we will have time for question and answers, so feel free to use the Q&A feature in your webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I definitely appreciate it. It is interesting to think about where we are now and what we need to do. I don't take it lightly that I come to you on this evening when so much is happening around this country. That as we think about where we are and where we want to be, it should encourage us to get in good trouble right now. It should encourage us to work harder. It should encourage us to keep pushing, because we are at that moment where everything we do will have an impact on the way this country moves forward. I also don't take it lightly that I come to you on the same night, the same day, the same moment, the same minute that this country has reached another milestone. It's one that Dr. Fauci warned us about. It's one that we didn't think we would hit this soon. It's one that kind of resonates with every part of who I am. The fact that America has hit 200,000 people who have died from COVID-19 in 33 weeks. I just want you to think about the full totality of that. That's more people than in the Vietnam War, in the Korean War, than people who died of gun deaths in 2018, of people who died from overdoses in 2018. If you combine all of them together, that's the number of people we've lost in 33 weeks. COVID-19 is now the second leading cause of death in this country, with heart disease being number one. I come to you in the middle of this environment, in the middle of a time where we are being called to get in good trouble. And I say that because I think a lot about Congressman John Lewis and how he challenged us to get in what he called good and necessary trouble. And then trying to figure out what that means for me. Is good and necessary trouble just about me being registered to vote? Is it about me making sure I get to the polls? Or is good and necessary trouble about me confronting the white supremacy, the racism, the classism, and the sexism that is embedded into the roots of our society? To me, that's good and necessary trouble. Saying that I won't sit back, I won't say it's okay, I won't allow them to take my silence as being complicit to the evil that's being wrought throughout this nation at this moment. It is a difficult time. It is a moment where it's what I call Black Lives Matter meets Black COVID stories. And I see us in Black Lives Matter 2.0. And I say that because of the activism work that many of us did doing Black Lives Matter 1.0. Even though some of our colleagues, particular colleagues that are not Black and not brown, did not recognize that there was a Black Lives Matter Part 1, that we were talking about Trayvon Martin and Eric Garner and Mike Brown and Tamir Rice and Sandra Bland and Corinne Gaines. I mean, I can keep going. All of those names were connected to people in our community, unarmed Black and brown men, women, and children who were killed either by the police or would-be vigilantes, as the case with Trayvon Martin, for example. That was an active part of our life. And even though a person sat in the White House who looked like us on the streets, we were fighting for justice. It was not until COVID-19, when everybody was shut in the house, not just in this country, but around the planet, that all of a sudden, with the unfortunate and horrible murder of George Floyd, people could not look away. All of a sudden, this idea around freedom and justice and equality and safety became part of everyone's lexicon. It was during that moment when everyone decided to come out of quarantine, to fight for justice for George Floyd and justice for Ahmaud Arbery and justice that we're still waiting on, by the way, for Breonna Taylor, justice for Rashad Brooks. We were adding names to it. That the level of commitment to Black Lives Matter from the white community, according to research, it hit around 70%. Everybody wanted to be anti-racist. And they were running out and buying books and ordering all the tools they needed to be an anti-racist mother or father or professor or teacher. Well, research has shown that in the last couple of weeks, if people have gotten back into their lives and school has started and jobs are moving forward, the interest in Black Lives Matter has dropped from 70% down to the low 30s. People are like, okay, equality shouldn't take this long. But the Black folks who've been fighting for freedom and justice and equality since 1619, we understand it's been a very long time, and that justice delayed is justice denied. And so I want to thank Jessica for inviting me to join you for your inaugural PACE lecture. And I am delighted to think about what this means for us. How does this call us to do something different at this moment? I'm delighted to think that I can do all of this with you while sitting in my office in Baltimore and having this conversation with you because of the way in the world has changed. On March 1st, 2020, while standing at the Edmund Pettus Bridge, civil rights icon, Congressman John Lewis, encouraged us then as a reminder to get in good and necessary trouble. He was saying that as we face the systemic racial injustices that are prevalent in our society and that persist in our nation, we should take that as a moment to, in his words, redeem the soul of our nation. On the day of his funeral, they ran an op-ed in the New York Times where it was called, "You Can Redeem the Soul of Our Nation." Congressman Lewis believed that the way you can redeem the soul is through voting, by making sure that you participate in your right to help shape what democracy looks like in this country. That you can use this as a moment to challenge the disadvantages that are suffered by people of color in this country. You can seek change to begin to reshape what our society looks like. We're at a moment now when we must fight to help co-create the world that we want to live in. In this moment where we're planning to vote, what I think about is, who am I voting for? That when I show up at the polls, who am I voting for? I challenge you to think about that tonight. When you vote, who do you vote for? And if you're just voting for yourself, I encourage you to realize that that's too narrow-minded, right? We don't just vote for ourselves. We show up and we vote for everyone who's going to come after us, knowing that the decision that we make in that moment, in that booth or at home at our table on our absentee ballot, can put people in place who can shape this nation for years to come. Here's an example of that. In 1896, with the Plessy v. Ferguson decision from the United States Supreme Court, the decision was made that they were setting up what they call separate but equal facilities, that is constitutional to have separate but equal facilities for Black people and for white people. And what we found was that separate meant that things were unequal, right? Because there were better facilities for whites, and the conditions for Black people from across the board, from the school systems to the trains to the buses to restaurants, all of those conditions were dehumanizing for Black people. But that was 1896. That was the Supreme Court. It took until 1954. Think about how long that took. Sometimes I am amazed that when you put someone in office as a Supreme Court justice who was there forever, as we found with the recent unfortunate death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, that you put someone in as a Supreme Court justice, they can shape policy that can last 2 to 3 generations. Think about that. From 1896 to 1954, that even though Brown v. Board in 1954 ended legalized segregation, even though in 1955, the Supreme Court came back and ruled in what they call Brown 2, that we do with all deliberate speed, we can make the argument that today, in 2020, we're still dealing with the long-term impact of that Plessy v. Ferguson decision. We're still trying to get the equality that we've been denied for so long. So when you go and vote, when you go and get in what they call good necessary trouble, the people that you put in office will determine how this country is going to move. Who do you vote for? My grandmother used to say that when she would try to go vote, and as a Black woman in South Carolina, she would show up at the polling place and they would be intimidated. Sometimes they would be threatened. Sometimes they would be grabbed. It was always a fight for her to try to get her vote counted. And in Columbia, South Carolina, the first state to secede from the Union, that still had the Confederate flag flying until Bree Newsom took it down, it was difficult to walk in there and have her vote be counted. But she said when she showed up, knowing it was going to be frightening and horrific, she did it not for herself. She said, I was doing it for the children of my children. I was doing it for you, my granddaughter. And so when I go and vote, when I show up and get in good necessary trouble, I do it for the children of my children. I do it because I understand that if you look at the history of this country, at the fact that people actually died so we could vote. It's interesting because I was saying that to my son, and he said, oh, no, mommy, we understand that people didn't actually die. People say that to force us to vote. I'm like, no, people actually died. They were actually willing to get beaten. They were actually willing to go to jail so that you can step into that booth, be protected, not have to deal with any kind of poll tax or literacy test, and actually cast your vote, participating in helping to shape this democracy. It goes back in so many ways to the 14th Amendment, which is why I see the long connection. The 14th Amendment in 1868 dealt with the protection and the guaranteeing of our civil rights in terms of our full citizenship that had been denied to us by law for so long. It connects directly to the 15th Amendment from 1870, which guaranteed the right of vote and the protection of vote for Black men, not for women, but for Black men. Incidentally, that's the part that split the Black and white women's movement coming together around the idea of why Black men should get the right to vote before white women did. It connects directly to the 19th Amendment in 1920 that guaranteed the right to vote for women, even though that meant white women, because Black women did not have our vote protected until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It was Black and Asian American women who finally had their vote protected, getting in good and necessary trouble. I know that in a lot of ways that I stand here, and I always think about this when I sit in my office, whose shoulders do I stand on? That I stand here because Rosa Parks sat. And I connect with Rosa Parks as an activist. Even though some people see her as a grandmother, we know that she was young in her 30s. She was an NAACP secretary. Her husband was actively involved. But Rosa Parks, in making that decision, that political decision to do what Claudette Colvin had done weeks before, which was refuse to budge, refuse to give in to white rule. setting off what Elridge Cleaver called a gear that was shifted somewhere in the universe that meant that things would never be the same. Knowing that I'm here because Harriet Tubman ran, that we just celebrated just a few weeks ago here in Maryland, the day that Harriet Tubman, Minty, made that decision to still herself, to claim her freedom, to make the decision to stand up, even though she did not know exactly the route she was going to take. I mean, it wasn't that there was a road and a GPS. She was relying on all the things her father had taught her, but that where she wanted to go, she believed was better than where she was. And then making the decision to get in good and necessary trouble and come back time and time again to make sure that every person that she came in contact with, primarily in Maryland, would have the opportunity to experience freedom as well. I'm here because of Mary McLeod Bethune and that she taught. Mary McLeod Bethune took $1.50 to start a school for Black girls. And Mary McLeod Bethune said she would write letters to white patrons to get money to fund her school. And she would describe the school in detail. And she said she was sitting in her office one day and a group of white men stepped into the office. She said they had their suits and they stepped into the office where her table was being held up by stacks of books. And she said she had nothing in the office and they wanted to know where was the school that they had been sending money to. And Mary McLeod Bethune said she took them to the window where they looked at was nothing but a field. And she said, the school exists right there in my mind. You can't see it yet. Only I can see it now. And when I get every dollar that I need, then you will be able to see it. What you've been doing, essentially, is planning into the dream that I have. And she did. She went on to build this school, getting in good necessary trouble by making the commitment to educate Black girls and to prepare them to be teachers, to be doctors, to be lawyers, to challenge the system in so many different ways. I'm here because of Ida B. Wells and the work that she did, putting her life on the line to write about lynching throughout the South. The work that Bryan Stevenson is doing today is made possible because Ida B. Wells did it. As a Black woman, to found her own newspaper, to fund her own research and say that someone has to document the lives of Black men and women and children who are being lynched throughout the South. There's stories of Ida B. Wells actually getting on the train moments before they were coming to get her to take her life because she was spreading the story. And then here because Dorothy Ahite organized. Dorothy Ahite, who went on to become the president of the organization that Mary McLeod Bethune founded, the National Council of Negro Women, that it was Dorothy Ahite sitting at the table with the Big Six. We know that Martin Luther King Jr. was at the table and John Lewis was at the table and Ralph Abernathy was at the table. Well, Dorothy Ahite was at the table as well, meeting with President John F. Kennedy. And she said in talking about what happened that day, she said they would often come in to take pictures and the photographer would ask her to step out of the pictures so they can just get what he called the Big Six. That's that terminology we use, the Big Six. Dorothy Ahite said there were 7 of us at the table. I was the 7th one and they would have me step out of the pictures. Dorothy Ahite, who made the decision, she said she broke with Dr. King based upon the March on Washington because the men who were organizing the March on Washington would not let any woman give a speech. In fact, they only allowed women to either sing, Mahalia Jackson and Odetta, or bring greetings, Daisy Bates and Josephine Baker on behalf of the French Embassy. They would not let a woman take the mic and give a speech. They said the issues we're dealing with go beyond the gender issues. And Dorothy Ahite said, I conceded that day, but I never conceded that point again. That notion of good and necessary trouble means that you also pick your battles and you figure out what you're going to do. This 21st century conversation with the ways in which we can pull all these pieces together, I think require us to take a hard look at where we've come historically, which is just looking at some of the key figures that I've laid out, but where we're going to go. I try to write a lot. I write as much as I can about what is happening. And I was trying to sum up, what does it mean to live at this moment when you have 3 factors coming together, three what I call, this kind of tridemic that's happening. I know they're calling it a twindemic, and they're talking about the flu and COVID-19. And I'm saying as a Black woman, it's a syndemic because you have all these other factors, but we have this tridemic happening now where we have COVID-19, we have Black Lives Matter, and we're doing all of this within this season where we have to get out and vote. That this notion of our fear around COVID-19, what's happening with the movement for Black lives, is all part of voter suppression tactics to make us afraid to step to the ballot, to make us have a concern that our ballots won't be counted, to make us want to step away from the process. And I think it's calling us to lean in even harder. It's calling us to think a little bit deeper about what's going on. I was writing about this, trying to sum up how I was feeling. What does good and necessary trouble mean to me as someone who tries to do the work that I can do on the front line? And so I was putting down, as someone who is helping to co-raise young African-American men and struggling with their own feelings around safety and the ways in which I challenge myself to confront the system, knowing when to fight and when to walk away, knowing that there are moments when fighting is the only thing you can do, even if it means you might not survive. And then there are moments when you walk away and you look to fight another day. Like those are choices, daily choices that we make in this space of Blackness and being a woman in this country that we wrestle with. And so I noted that at this moment, the broken down souls of Black and brown women rarely get a chance to mourn, that we have to rise in every single sense, thinking that if we didn't, that if we just stood still, then the world itself would stop moving. Like we've come to believe that Black women and brown women are so essential that even to our last breath, we have to hold this country up. And that's kind of an interesting perspective to think about, because Black and brown women tend to work the hardest in this society for the least amount of money. When it comes to getting paid for our labor, we make very little money on the dollar in comparison to our white male and white female colleagues. And I use male and female very specifically in that particular instance, because that's the way it's written in the documentation. I'm like, that is how they see us, as females who should make less money. That Black and brown women, as we push forward, we understand that because of the number of bodies, because of the memories, because of the bullets, because of the marches, because of the hashtags, because we cannot properly mourn, we have to push against the truth that is in front of us. We have to not accept that what they're telling us, even when we can see something different, what they're telling us is not the truth about who we are. That getting in good and necessary trouble means that when they want us to walk slowly with our hands up, to kneel down at the feet of oppression, to lay on the ground, to hold our breaths and not make a sound, that it is in that moment that we push back. Dr. King, when he was talking about nonviolence, talked about the fact that it is our love that is a weapon that will protect us. And I was thinking a lot about Dr. King. I often do when I start thinking about the work of John Lewis and I think about the work of Dorothy Ahide. Immediately, I think about Dr. King. I said, wow, here's a man who believed in nonviolence, who was murdered in this country. And the fact that he was unable to see his children grow up, to see some of the dreams that he had come to fruition. What does it mean to choose life in those moments? What does it feel like that the very leaders of the movement, if you're talking about King and X, and you're talking about Medgar Evers, were shot and were killed and were never able to move to the next level? That as Black and brown people, we have learned to love this society despite the fact as I heard a coach say a couple of weeks ago, that we love America even though America does not love us back. Like, we fiercely hold on to the belief that if we push hard enough, then America will love us back. There's something kind of destructive about loving and loving and loving and not getting that love returned. I kind of think about that a lot. I'm like, how much do I love this country? James Baldwin said it's because he fiercely loves America that he critiques her. And that's paraphrasing what he said. And I think about that. How much do I love this country? Well, I love it enough to critique it. I love it enough to fight for what it could be. I love it enough to not accept where it is now. I love it enough to know that one man and one party cannot continue to keep their knee, in the words of Reverend Al Sharpton, on our necks. I love it enough to push it to become better than what it is at this moment. I mean, that to me is what love in action looks like, working to change the direction of this country. Solidarity is a word I want to put on the table as well, because solidarity to me is a verb, that it's an action word, and that we choose to occupy spaces and be engaged in the process. That in 1848, in the middle of American enslavement, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who many of you know on her work around women's suffrage, and 4 of her friends, they met and they had tea, and they were complaining about the limitations placed on their own situation and their lives under America's new democracy. And at that point, it had been about 70 years since America had fought to free itself from tyranny. And yet women were not included in any substantial way, taking into account that Black folks were also not included in this conversation in any substantial way. You know, it's the lives of Black people who were kind of on the fringes that, even though they were not included, they were part of the conversation. What began as a simple conversation led to a convention to discuss the social, civil, and religious conditions and rights of women. They met and they drafted the Declaration of Sentiments, which directly connected the nascent campaign for women's rights to the American symbol of liberty. And this is what they wrote, and Stanton wrote this directly. The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man toward woman, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. White women speaking up and saying that we want our lives and experiences and perspectives to be part of the conversation. At the same time this is happening, and people don't talk about it very much, free Black women were having the same conversations. Between Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, between Sarah Parker Ramon, these conversations where they wanted their lives and experiences and perspectives to be part of the conversation, to not be considered to just be property, to not be considered to just be materials that can be subjected to rape and beatings and suffering in silence for the entire world to see and bear witness, but to challenge that notion and to push back. Now, among the white women, they drafted 13 resolutions, and all but one passed with unanimous endorsement, and that was the one for women's enfranchisement, that women should be allowed to vote in elections. At that moment, it was really inconceivable to many of the people that they pulled together for this convention. Now, the story goes that the women that were present were in this uproar, and that it did not subside. And I always wonder if it's because a man told this story, but hear me out. He said it did not subside until Frederick Douglass, who called himself a woman's rights man. That was his term for himself, a woman's rights man. He stood up and he spoke, and this is what he said. He said, woman, like the slave, he argued, had the right to liberty. Suffrage is the power to choose rulers and make laws, and the right by which all others are secured. He said that then, but I would argue it's just as true today. The vote is the power to choose the rulers, choose the leaders, choose the representatives who will make the laws. That when we vote, we're not just voting for the person who is occupying that space on the line. I mean, for those who years ago voted for the current president, it wasn't just that person you were voting for. You were voting for all the judges that were put in place, all the justices that he put in place, all the policies that came out of it. It's not just one vote for one person. You're actually voting for a direction. And when you don't vote and you don't put some skin in the game, then whatever direction that the country moves in, you are complicit because you chose to be silent at a moment when you were supposed to be actively involved. Solidarity is a verb. Solidarity is something that should be an action word. In that first wave of the women's rights movement, when women fought for and received the right to vote in 1920, there was a sense that for Black women and for Asian American women, that particular amendment applied to them. But when Black women and Asian American women ended up at the booth, it was the same type of hostility, the same pushback, the same denial. And so they did not have the extension of that right to vote. Mary McLeod Bethune was actively involved with Eleanor Roosevelt. And Eleanor Roosevelt at that time was the chair of the Commission on the Status of Women, where they were looking at the state of women. This was in 1961 at the behest of Esther Peterson. They were trying to figure out what was the status of women. What exactly did women want? And I think that's an interesting question. Maybe it's one that we've been wrestling with for a long time. What exactly do we want? And at that time, for Black women, they were writing about things like the right to speak freely, the right to make our own money, the right to take care of our homes, the right to live safely. Like the same things they were arguing for are the same things I would say we're arguing for today. That we're still dealing with the equal pay gap. The fact that Black women don't make as much as their peers until August. I mean, think about what that means. That white men make $1 on $1 in 1 year. Black women don't catch up till August of the following year. So we have to work 1 year and 8 months to make what our white male counterparts make in 1 year. Same job, same experiences, same credentials, same background. We're making it 1 year into August of the following year. For Hispanic women, they don't hit Women's Equality Day until you get into September, close to October. And for Indigenous women, not until almost November. Think about that. For Indigenous women, they're working almost 2 years to make the same dollar that their white male counterparts. For white women, they hit Women's Equality Day in April. Now, still a little bit of a lag, but I think when you're talking about November, you're talking about being permanently behind, never being able to catch up. That the same thing that the status of women argued for back then is the same thing that we're arguing for now. Title IX of the 1964 Civil Rights Act was passed during the same time back in 1964, prohibiting employment discrimination on the basis of sex as well as race, religion, and national origin. That was prohibited, but what didn't happen is you didn't have that equality when it came to how much money you made. Why does that matter? Because over a lifetime, you lose almost $1 million in wages as Black, Hispanic, and Indigenous women because you are permanently working to try to catch up. Not to mention that there's a pause put when you have children, where your career in so many ways stalls. In 1972, 26% of men and women said they would not vote for a woman for president. In 1996, that sentiment had plummeted just over 5% for women and to 8% for men. So there was a sense that the country was ready when Hillary Rodham Clinton took the stage. She was ready to actually elect a woman. And what did we find? We found that Black women, we found that Black men, we found that Hispanic men, Hispanic women went in the booth and followed what we had all agreed to do. We were going to put Hillary Clinton in to deny the life that we now had under this particular president. That making a decision to vote as a feminist. What does it mean to vote as a feminist? To talk about the long-term interests. between not just going for the lesser of two evils, which I think is not really the best way to vote, because you're saying that you feel like you have no choice. You have the lesser of two evils. That you, as they say today, you just settle for Biden rather than enthusiastically getting behind your candidate because you know you're going to see something happen to change. Well, Roxane Gay, in her book, Bad Feminist, which I love, she gave feminists and women permission and encouragement to simply be themselves. In fact, she wrote, no matter what issues I have with feminism, I am a feminist. I cannot and will not deny the importance and absolute necessity of feminism. Like most people, I am full of contradictions. I am a bad feminist. I would rather be a bad feminist than no feminist at all. I think about that a lot because on good days, I would say I am a strong Black feminist, rising and meeting every challenge, walking forward, pulling people along with me, pulling folks who would rather remain in a very neat and small racist and sexist and classist box. On those days, I can pull people out. Like I actually can actively confront them, whether it's on Twitter or in my classroom, to challenge them to be better. But there are some bad days, right? That as a Black feminist, I put it on like a blanket. It covers me, it protects me, it warms me, but it also insulates me from the world. Days when I'm letting the comments that are made slide by me rather than confront them. Knowing that if I confronted every racist or misogynistic comment that I heard in my sphere back before we were locked in our own circles, it would be a full-time job. But I was saying I'd rather be a bad feminist than no feminist at all. That part of this, in terms of the good necessary trouble, I think is to take into account what Kimberly Crenshaw talks about with intersectionality. How do you enter into the discussion? That if the point is to get to where you're going to create some good necessary trouble, whatever that means. How do you enter into that? What's good and necessary trouble for you? When I think about that point where all of that intersects for me, and I think about what does it mean to be Black, to be a woman, to deal with my own class struggles, to be a mother, knowing that gender identity and racism and classism, that they're all bound together. And that I stand at this point where I'm looking at both the Black liberation movement and the women's movement, and I'm doing it from a space where I can actually begin to shift and make changes, then good necessary trouble is something I can do every day. That even if I can't go out and get arrested, which I know in terms of putting your body on the line, I can be actively involved. I can raise my pen as a weapon and be actively involved in this movement to change things. The work that I do when I'm trying to challenge is finding ways to get out of the academy. I mean, the academy is never a place that I wanted to call home. Like I never really thought that the academy is where you can make good and necessary trouble, right? The academy is a place I would rather stay away from because it's something that just kind of boggles the mind of sitting back in faculty meetings and spending, 3-4 months arguing about comma placement and writing this book that you think is brilliant that 3 people read and publishing an article that you have put everything, you've sweated onto the page that goes into a journal that maybe 2 people read, but that the work to confront the issues around race and around gender and around class, that's the work that's happening in the street. So how do you find a bridge between those things? For me, it was trying to find a way to get from the ivory tower, whatever that means, into where people were struggling. And that was evolving into being a public intellectual. That is where I do my work, what I call getting in good and necessary struggle and trouble. My sons once asked me, what does a Black feminist look like? And they asked me this question when they were 4 and 5 years old. And they are now 19 and 17. And believe me, I remind them often that they said this to me because I'm expecting to see the fruit of my labor today. But when they were 4 or 5, they said, what does it mean to be a Black feminist, Mommy? And I said then that if I do my job right, that when you grow up, you'll see a Black feminist every time you look into the mirror. And so when I asked them today, hey, do you see a Black feminist? It's interesting to listen to the ways in which they define feminism. Feminism through a sphere of being a Black man, a young man in America, has a different feel of feminism than coming through my lens. And that to me is how you can evolve the work, that you look at how you enter into the space and then you work through that at that movement. At that moment. I'd like to, in the last little bit of time I have left, I want to suggest that there are 3 things, because I think there should be some type of walk away, right? So the 3 things I think that you need to have in your arsenal, that as you prepare what this space is going to look like for you, as you make a decision to define it, to shape it, to work within it, to say, this is how I enter, this is how my voice is going to remain, this is who I'm going to be. And that years from now, when someone looks at the body of my work, that this is the moment when I decided who I was going to be. I mean, because I think America calls on you to decide who you're going to be, and it's something you're probably asking yourself all the time. So I think there are 3 things you need to have in your arsenal. The first, I would argue, is commitment laced with passion. That I think you have to be absolutely committed to finishing the race. Now, in 1992, during the Olympics, there was a runner by the name of Derek Redmond. And so I know many of you probably have no idea who he is, but he is a runner, and he was running track. And he was going around the first lap. But they thought he was going to win. Like, he was predicted to be the winner at the Olympics. He went around the first lap in Barcelona, and he pulled his hamstring, and he began to limp. And if you go back and you can Google and you can see the footage, he continues to hobble around the track. Now, at this moment, of course, the race has moved on. Everyone's running, people are going on, hitting the ribbon, but he continues to hobble along the track. And then people are starting to wonder, why doesn't he just move? And during that time, back in 1992, people could get on the field. And they said it was a man that broke through, got on the track with him. It was his father. And his father took his hand and put his arm around his son's waist, and took his son's hand and put it around his shoulders. And he helped his son finish that race. And so later, when they interviewed Derek, they wanted to know why he didn't just stop. And he said, I came to Barcelona to finish a race and not just to start one. He said, I did not even know I was going to finish until my father came out and he carried me. I would argue that we are where we are today in 2020 at this moment because we are the descendants of people who chose to survive. We are the descendants of people whose work ethic, whose beliefs, whose prayers, whose spirituality, whose resistance, whose good necessary trouble carried us to this point. That when we go into that voting booth, we go in there knowing that we are descendants from survivors. So we have to have a commitment to finishing this race. The second tool is about the character that you have. I believe that the true mark of your character is being able to stand up in the face of incredible odds and meet your destiny head on. Like, there are moments in your life when you have to decide who you're going to be and whether you have the ability to be race brave. Like, can you stand up and confront the evils in our society? Can you work hard to be brave? And can you be brave enough to be free? Dr. King said there were 3 evils that we had to confront in our society. This was in 1967. Now, the world was in love with Dr. King in 1963. He was the I Have a Dream man, Nobel Peace Prize winner. Like, the world loved Dr. King 63, 64, and 65, right? But by the time you got to 66, when he began to openly confront the Vietnam War, and his popularity began to fall. And he moved off of the Time magazine, most honored, most admired people. And you had a large portion of the white community, more than 70% at that time, and a large portion of the Black community, between 30 to 40% of the community, did not like Dr. King, did not trust him. He was hated at that point because he was going after the Vietnam War. And in 1967, Dr. King gave a speech, and he said, there are three evils that must be confronted. You know, in confronting these, you figure out who you are. He said, it's the evils of racism, which is clear. Think about 1967 and what was happening. There were race riots happening all over the country. That was a year when Lyndon Baines Johnson asked the Kerner Commission to put together their report. He said, but it's also the evil of militarism. Remember the Vietnam War and the ways in which America was trying to force people to become democratic in their society, even if it meant killing everybody. And then he said it was the evil of materialism. He said capitalism has to be dismantled if Black people want to be free. When you think about what got Dr. King killed, think about that. Racism, militarism, and materialism. Disbanding this notion of race-based equality, dismantling that so that it actually happens. That's the content of your character, not the color of your skin. Dismantling capitalism, which is what feeds our economy and really why we're where we are today in the midst of a global pandemic and we have to get back to work. And then militarism. Think about that when you think about the police coming out to clear out the church so Donald Trump can hold up a Bible. What military style police in this country? Your character. Audre Lorde said it best. She said, I have learned how to dance in time for the next party. My room is too small for me. Suppose I die before graduation. They will sing sad melodies, but finally tell the truth about me. Your character. First is commitment, second is character, and the third, I would argue, is to be able to tell the truth about your limitations. Do you know who you are? Are you able to do what Michelle Obama said a long time ago? She's now since further clarified that. Remember she said, when they go high, we go, when they go low, we go high is what she said. I remember when she said that. And I stopped to think, okay, so when they go low, we go high. Well, sometimes you got to go low. Like that's actually what I believe, that sometimes you can't go high. Sometimes you actually have to go low and be willing to fight to get the change that you need to see happen. Sometimes you got to be able to say, I'm not putting up with this anymore. I'm Claudette Colvin, I'm not getting up off the bus. I'm Rosa Parks and I'm saying no. I'm Ella Baker and I'm saying, if you want to move, you're going to have to move me. I'm Fannie Lou Hamer saying, you know what, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. Sometimes I'm like, you got to go low. And in going low, you'll get high, but sometimes you have to be willing to fight. And so first is you got to have your commitment laced with passion. Second, you have to know the content of your character. And third, you have to be willing to fight. When you think about good and necessary trouble, and this is where I'll end, I think it's also about having faith that things will get better. Can you help to shape the world that you want the children of your children to live in? That knowing that the work we do today, that it may not get better for us. Like that's the absolute truth. The work that's being done now, like we have so much that has to be dismantled if we want this country to get even back to where it used to be and then be better. That the world we're creating, we may not benefit from it. That's just the truth. But are we willing to make the commitment, to stand in our own power, to recognize the content of our character, to know when to go low and when to go high, because we want this world to be better for the children of our children. That's who I fight for. That's what good and necessary trouble means for me, as I'm fighting to create a world that I may never see come about. But knowing that when the final story is written, that the work that I've done, it will be part of that full catalog about how America was shaped and how it was made better. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. K. That was wonderful. We have some questions beginning to come in to the Q&A feature. And so I just want to give people a moment to know that that is a way to submit a question for Dr. K to answer and talk about. and let's open up some of those questions and have a little bit of conversation. All right, so it looks like the first question here is asking about Hillary Clinton winning the popular vote. So why do you think she didn't run for president this time? And let's see here, I'm paraphrasing. Why didn't you feel that she would get the support if she ran this time, in your opinion? So why did Hillary kind of not make a run this time?
I think Hillary Clinton and her space within the Democratic Party has greatly been shrunk over the last 4 years with Donald Trump. Hillary Clinton was a rising star. But she was a rising star that was strapped to the wagon of Bill Clinton. I mean, his baggage was pretty heavy in terms of the ways in which people were negotiating around her record, even the first time. Like all the enthusiasm that we had the very first time before Barack Obama came on the scene. The idea of shifting to Barack Obama, which is a really calculated shift that was made, because it took the work of Black men, John Lewis, Elijah Cummings, to come behind Barack Obama to convince the Black community not to vote for Hillary Clinton and shift our direction behind Barack Obama. And then she became Secretary of State. And so when she ran against Trump, there was an enthusiasm among some about Hillary Clinton, and there were others who were greatly concerned about her record. We can see that her star is not as bright based upon the last Democratic convention. I mean, think about how much time she was given to speak and how they greatly reduced the role of Bill Clinton. I mean, that's the party of the past. The party moving forward is the party of someone like a Kamala Harris, a Stacey Abrams, an AOC. Now, unfortunately, that's a party that still has a white man from a throwback era, septuagenarian, in the main position of power, which I think should challenge people to wonder, why do people feel that the only way to get the current white man out of office is to put another white man against him? Why is there a belief that America writ large, not the Black and brown community, won't vote or wouldn't have voted for a Black woman to challenge Donald Trump? There was a sense that Black women and Black men and Hispanic women would not get the same space and respect, as people were afraid that they wouldn't beat Donald Trump. Think about the power of whiteness and maleness in this country. If we cannot beat Donald Trump unless we put up another white man. That's the throwback to that era. And so Hillary Clinton would not have received the kind of support, the kind of enthusiasm that Kamala Harris has gotten. Kamala Harris, who many believe, along with the people that I mentioned earlier, women I talked about earlier, and you can add in Julian Castro in that, are the future of the party. The Democratic Party, if it wants to continue to move forward, has to have the people at the top of the ticket that represents the browning of this country. The Republican Party, someone wrote, was the party of Lincoln and so many Black abolitionist heroes, which included Frederick Douglass. Is there a plan to get the Black community more involved in getting the party back to its roots? That's interesting, because I think that in trying to tie Black folks, first of all, we're not a monolith, but trying to tie us to a party takes away the reason why Black people were committed to the Republican Party. They were committed to the Republican Party because of the civil rights agenda of the Republican Party. And when that began to shift, and you saw the Democratic Party really holding true to helping to meet the promise that Black people have had in this country of getting equality and justice, Black folks moved over to the Democratic Party. It's not about getting back to the Republican Party. I would argue it's about creating a party where our interests are met. I'm feeling that neither one of the parties are completely meeting the needs of Black and brown folks in this country. They're not completely meeting the needs of people that are economically challenged in this country. Unfortunately, every time we talk about it, we argue it's not time yet for a third party. It's time we have to go a Democratic Republic, and they keep folding us into the same box. At some point, I think that we're going to have to decide that we don't want to be a two-party country. We want to have parties that reflect us more. I'm interested in seeing what happens once we get through Joe Biden. Let's just assume that Joe Biden does what he said he's going to do. He's going to do one term only, which I think is interesting because I think power tends to destroy absolutely, right? So let's say he just does one term and Kamala Harris becomes the face of the party because as vice president, she would move into that position. And then you look on the Republican side and they put up Nikki Haley, they put up Tim Scott, right? So you can essentially end up having Black and brown people in the positions of power for both parties. But do the needs of the people change? No. Has the party been to that? I'm not sure. I'm not sure if the party machine is going to change if we have a Black or brown person at the top of the ticket, because we saw that with Barack Obama. We had a Black man at the White House, but when it translated to on the ground, we were fighting for Black Lives Matter. Someone asked, what is your opinion on choosing the lesser of two evils? Do you believe this is an accurate statement for the situation? I believe that Joe Biden has a record that's pretty controversial. I believe Joe Biden has made a lot of decisions that have ended up with Black folks being incarcerated, with Black folks being stripped of their rights. I believe Joe Biden's record with the ways in which he has treated women are questionable. I believe Joe Biden tried to make up for that when he worked with Barack Obama as vice president. Does that mean that Joe Biden is the best choice for America? I think when you look at the two people that are on the table, unfortunately, the two people that allows us to look at where we are now. I know Joe Biden's record. Joe Biden, I believe, will be at the table with Black and brown men and women and trans folks, people from the LGBTQIA community, and different needs will be brought to the table. They can put his feet to the fire in ways that we don't see this president's feet to the fire. That's what I'm concerned about. That remember, we're not just voting for one person. We're voting for all the people that will be at that table, what laws are going to come out of it, who's going to be justice, who's going to be a judge, that all of that will be adjusted. I mean, Joe Biden released the names of 2 Supreme Court justices, possibilities, and both of them are Black women. He said, I'm going to put a woman in the second position, and he did. I joined late. Do you think about the Supreme Court? How do I feel about the Supreme Court nomination being pushed through? Unfortunately, I think they should go with the same decision they made with Merrick Garland. They should wait, and they should let the next president make that decision. When they made that decision with Barack Obama, there were 342 days left before the election. They said it's too soon. He's a lame duck president. Well, if Barack Obama was lame duck at 342 days out, then don't you think this president is lame duck, and we're talking November 3rd in the next 6 to 8 weeks or so? They should wait, but they're not going to wait. I think that we're getting ready to go into a very dangerous position, because if he gets another justice, which is what they're pushing to do, think about the Supreme Court having that type of lean and slant with young justices. This is not people who are coming in and they're in their 80s. He's talking people in their 50s who could help shape laws for the next 100 years. Like, that is huge and frightening to think about a bench that has a 6-3 balance. And given the fact that the next Justice Breyer is in his 80s, if Donald Trump's reelected and that's another justice spot that's open, then you're talking perhaps 7-2. And that is a little bit frightening, I would argue. The balance on the Supreme Court being lost. Mark wants to know, it's not your job to make white people feel good in these challenging times, but in your work of confronting hard truths for white people, how do you approach white people to engage them? Or do you even have an approach to white people? I have an approach to people. I believe that issues around race, around class, and around sexism, it's not about whether I'm white or Black, it's about the justice and equality. And I don't think I can say, well, because I'm a white person, I can have empathy. No, as a citizen of this country, as a human being, these are human rights issues. No Black man should have to walk into a place and because they accuse him of passing a counterfeit $20 bill, that he ends up on the ground with a knee on his neck and he dies. No Black child should be shot in the street like Mike Brown and left to bleed out for 4 hours. These are not black and white issues. These are human rights issues. And I engage with anyone who's white, Black, Asian, Hispanic, who would like to have a conversation around human rights and how we can bring about that in this country. How do you hold local politicians accountable after the election, even if they represent a different party? By showing up. I tell people that when you vote on a local level, since all politics are local, Are you going to board meetings? Are you helping to organize in your community? Are you writing letters? Are you giving a call? Are you holding your local politicians' feet to the fire? That's the only way that we can do it. You can make decisions on the local level because this is where you can start. Someone says, how can we begin? I say you begin where you are now, that we're already in a race. And the deal is we're not going to stop for you to get in the race. You just have to join us running. We've been running this race to bring about the changes that need to happen in this country for a long time. I think of it like Schubert's Unfinished Symphony, right? So we came into this race and the music was already playing. Our job is to sweeten it a little bit more, because eventually when we're gone, when we run on ahead to see how the end's going to be, the music is going to continue. Are we preparing the next generation to continue with this fight? And I would argue, I'm a Generation Xer, I would argue that millennials and zillennials are preparing me. I'm sandwiched between the baby boomers that fought for the civil rights movement and my sons, the zillennials, who marched out for March for Our Lives, dealing with gun control, talking about climate change. Like, they're forcing the Xers to come out of the academy and to be actively involved in helping to change this society. We cannot hide ourselves away, being a soccer mom or dad, and assume that we can work ourselves out of the things that are holding us back in this country. We actually have to work on those things. We have to confront them, and we have to fight, not just what's happening in the system, but even our own feelings around race and around gender and around class. How do you advise against fighting against racial fatigue? That's a good question. I'm trying to figure that out. I think I find moments of peace and joy, and I find ways to immerse myself in things that don't have anything to do with race. But because I am a Black woman in America, I'm never out of that place. I'm never moving into a society, moving into a space where I don't think about the fact that I am a Black woman. I don't have that luxury to not think about race and to not think about gender. And so I make peace with it. And I pick and choose when I'm going to fight and when I choose to disengage. I think self-care is an important lesson that Black women and Black people and brown people are learning. And if COVID-19 hasn't taught us anything else, because what COVID-19 has laid bare is a disproportionate killing of Black people by this disease in the middle of this global pandemic, that self-care is something that we need to focus on. I was thinking about Chadwick Boseman and how many Black people started thinking about a colonoscopy after Black Panther died, because these are issues we don't think about. And hopefully, coming out of COVID-19, we will recognize why self-care is so important. Ms. Savina said, what do you think about getting rid of the Democratic and Republican parties and creating something fresh that reflects the energy and values of the up-and-comers like AOC and Kamala Harris? I would say yes, but. Yes, we should create something fresh and reflects the energy and values of the up-and-comers, but I would not add Kamala Harris as an up-and-comer. I just want to be very clear. I would add AOC, definitely as an up-and-comer, talking about the Progressive Party. Kamala Harris is part of the establishment. Her record in California, she is part of the, I think she'd be a great vice president, but Kamala Harris is a part of the establishment. They went with the safest choice when you think about it. Her record against Black men and incarcerated people is something we're going to have to hold her to task with after she's elected, of course. But I wouldn't say she's an up-and-comer breaking with the rank and file. No, someone like an AOC and Stacey Abrams would be very interesting as a choice. But Kamala Harris is definitely establishment. And Elizabeth Warren, anyone who's currently sitting there in Senate has been there, that's part of the establishment. I mean, Cory Booker, as much as I love him, he's been part of the establishment since he was in Jersey. You're part of the establishment. And that is okay. But if we want something fresh and new, that means breaking with that and really making the attempt to do something different. And a lot of people aren't prepared to do that. The role of primary education in creating opportunities for low-income families and children. Our large cities have public school systems that few parents would choose. I think what is happening during COVID-19 is that we actually are rethinking education. No one ever talked about the inequities in the school system until they saw what it looked like with COVID-19. I am a former public school teacher here in Baltimore City. I taught in the most persistently dangerous middle school in this city. And so when COVID-19 hit, I said then, as I often say, when I talk about Baltimore City in my column for the Afro, I said inequity is going to meet reality. when Black and brown children go home and they don't have access to technology. Inequity is going to meet reality when they don't have food to eat because the school is providing breakfast and lunch for them. We're going to see the real fruit of our labor and our lack of love and attention to what is happening in public school. And COVID-19 has laid that bare. And it's painful for me to think that we're going to come through COVID-19 because eventually America is going to move on. But we would not have transformed education as a result of it. Instead, parents are struggling with trying to get what their children need. Meanwhile, students that attend independent private schools and county schools are doing very well. They have all the technology, they're moving forward. It is the young people that are within these public school systems in the inner city that are struggling and that are being left behind. And that is a great concern. One of the things that keeps me up at night. Someone asked, what will it take for other ethnic groups, white women, Latina, Hispanics, and other people of color that are experiencing the same, if not worse, oppressions as Black America to start voting against their own interests? That is a question that I've been struggling with for a long time. I will argue that when you look at the percentage of Black men with a college degree, about 70% of them voted for Hillary Clinton. There was a good 30%. Out of that 30%, about 15% voted for Donald Trump. A Black man without a college degree, around 80% voted for Hillary Clinton. There was another 18% that voted for Trump. There are a lot of people who vote against their own interests. But I argue that because we're not a monolith, I'm not sure if there's one whole big interest. What we need is we need to think about what are the most important things that we want to have on the table. What are the things that you want your candidates to really look at doing? What is it that you can't do without? And it used to be you'd find a candidate that met that. Unfortunately, in this environment, everyone's become concerned with getting this particular president out of office. Okay, so say that's accomplished. So say November 4th, we wake up and there's a different president and a different vice president. I think at that point, the work that's going to have to be done to repair what is happening in this country, we are a divided nation at this moment. I go back to the Kerner Commission. I mentioned that earlier, but in 1967, Lyndon Baines Johnson looked out and at all the uprisings that were happening within the Black communities. And he said, I need to find out, what do Black people want? And I'll paraphrase the story to keep it short. What do Black people want? So Lyndon Baines Johnson did what any reasonable and sane person would do. He pulled together a committee of all white men. So go find out what Black people want and let us know. But that commission, led by Otto Kerner, released a study 1 month before Dr. King was assassinated, by the way, called the Kerner Commission. And they said that America was rapidly becoming two societies, right? One white, one Black, separate and unequal. They said what Black folks want is they really want to live in safer neighborhoods. They want to have better schools, and they want to make more money for their jobs. And Lyndon Baines Johnson said, I've done so much for Black people. I'm annoyed that you're saying this, but he rejected that study. But here's the thing, 30 years later, in 1998, the Eisenhower Foundation redid the study. They said, well, you know what? It's 1998. The world has changed. More Blacks are in government positions, graduating from college. Maybe we're better now. And the Kerner Commission, redone by the Eisenhower Foundation in 1998, said America is even more divided. And that Black people are still asking for the same thing. They want to live in better and safer neighborhoods. They want better schools for their children. And they want to make more money like their white peers. And it was rejected in 1998. Fast forward again, at the 50-year mark of that 1968 study, they redid it under Trump, by the way, in 2018. This time, instead of all white men, like the Kerner Committee and the Eisenhower Foundation, they pulled together Black women, Hispanic men, Indigenous women and men. They had a diverse committee saying, take a look at America. How are we doing 50 years out? And what they found in 2018, they said America is more divided today than it was in 1968. That we are now a society, there's been a browning of this country that's connected to poverty in this country. And what do Black people want? Better schools. They want to live in safer neighborhoods, and they want to make the same amount of money that their white peers make. Donald Trump, of course, I mean, I'm not even sure if he even looked at the study. The point is, in that time, what has changed is that we're more divided. The needs and the demands of the Black community haven't changed, The country's just more divided because the forces that want to keep Black folks and brown folks and indigenous folks oppressed as the permanent underclass are working to set up a system of apartheid. Because by 2040, when whites are in the minority in this country, if we continue down this vein with these conservative justices, they will have power in their hands, very similar to how a small group of South Africans control the entire country. And that's why it's so dangerous. Let's see here. Bell Hooks talks about self-care. How can our students of all positionalities engage in intentional self-care? I think that COVID-19, even though it was a really crazy and stressful time, and people, the suffering that has happened, one of the things that made me happy with COVID-19 was watching people find joy in walking, find joy in baking bread, find joy in adopting pets. I'm like, it forced us to realize and recognize, and this is painful to admit, that if we leave our companies, they're going to continue. If we leave our schools, it's going to continue. That if we're talking about taking care of ourselves, that we have to intentionally make those choices every day. And so I never did this before COVID-19, because before COVID-19, it was like, I have to keep working so I can hold up my institution, so I can hold up my job. And what I've learned is that if I want to hold myself up, then I have to have intentional moments when I realize the world's going to continue without me. And so I find moments every day for just joy, for just myself, for just peace. And I force myself to do it because we live in a society that actually looks down on you for taking time to stop and be with yourself. COVID-19 made us realize and recognize that the time we spend with ourselves and with our family is even more precious, because we're living in a time when it's not guaranteed. I'll answer a couple more.
Well, I think that's probably a good time to end for the evening, to respect your time. If you want to take one or two more, we can do that. But I definitely want to also let everyone know that we are recording this webinar, and it will be put on the Carter G. Woodson Center YouTube page. So you'll be able to find that recording later after we end. And I want to make sure that we thank Dr. Whitehead for being our speaker this evening and for engaging us in some of the groundwork for our good and necessary trouble that we need to get into, while also remembering that caring for ourselves and being in it for the marathon rather than the sprint is the important part of our work here. So thank you so much, Dr. Whitehead.
Thank you very much. I didn't realize what time it was. I really enjoyed the engagement. I enjoyed the rapid fire questions at the end, and I look forward to coming back and kind of picking up for part 2 of our conversation. Thank you.